someone is molesting people. In fact, killing them. Biting them.
The calling card of a vampire. Like you.
I've been hunted down in the streets and attacked. I'm a victim here too.
I'm performing an independent investigation here in an attempt to understand precisely what is going on. A vampire is at work here. Famished. Reckless. It must be brought to ground, and quickly. Join my staff at Pembroke Hospital. As a physician. I suspect you'll not find a better post of employment to contemplate your predicament. The post would be for the night shift, providing a good explanation for your absence during daylight hours.
Yours is a generous offer, so I thank you.
Brilliant! Oh, Jonathan, this is one for the book, and the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Name's Clay Cox. I'd appreciate you helping me to a better place, Doc.
Follow me, Mr. Cox. Let me assist you to that better place.
Bring this fading light into the shadows. Dance with him the dance of life and death.
No more. Not tonight. Not like this. I will not take another life. I found a wounded man by the docks. He answers to the name of Clay Cox. He requires urgent medical attention.
Already making the rounds? That's the Pembroke spirit. I'll ask our porter, Milton, to bring him back immediately.
Thank you, nurse. What can I do for you?
Dr. Swansea insisted we provide you a quiet office. You'll find it on the second floor with your name on the door.
Thank you. Nurse Crane, isn't it?
Yes, Dorothy Crane. Welcome to Pembroke Hospital, Dr. Reed.
Hello everyone, this is WarriorDan and welcome to What is the Point of? And today we will be diving into the Gothic world of London, set roughly around 1918 or 1919, during the later years of the Spanish influenza, the respiratory airborne pathogen that would go on to claim the lives of between 50 and 100 million people and infect a total of 500 million people. Fun fact, it's considered one of the biggest, most widespread diseases of all time. You, the player, will be taking on the role of Dr. Jonathan Reed, a renowned doctor specializing in blood transfusion, a technique that we commonly use today in medicine, but was revolutionary at the time. You start the game being mysteriously brought back to life as a vampire, and through a desire for revenge and answers, you make it your goal to find the vampire that bit you, thus securing your one potential chance at ending the curse. The irony of a doctor known for his work in blood transfusion becoming a vampire is not lost on you, nor your closest allies. Vampire is a single-player, character-driven action RPG with equal focus on both combat and conversation choices. I use the term character-driven in that, unlike Don't Nod Entertainment's last developed game, Life is Strange, Vampire is not strictly bound to a overarching narrative like Life is Strange, and instead embraces a partially open-world setting, focusing on providing a vast array of supportive NPCs for the player to interact with. The problem is these characters, for the most part, lack any sense of identity. Just off the top of my head, I can name a dozen characters from Life is Strange, starting from Max, to Chloe, to Frank, to Principal Wells, to Joyce, Victoria, and the list goes on. All of these names pop into my head because I can identify with those characters and they made a strong impression on me. But in Vampire, the only person I can think of is Dr. Jonathan Reed himself, the protagonist. And that's probably because he spends what seems like half the game telling everyone his name. Maybe because Don't Nod itself knows that the player will never remember their character's own name, because the character is that forgettable. Many characters seem confined to just being standard stereotypes, similar to what one could expect from a low-budget period piece TV show. Just in a single hour of me running around and tormenting the local NPCs, I encountered a number of stereotypical standouts. You have the arrogant old Catholic priest who denies scientific and medical fact, even when presented to him, and who chooses to spend his time complaining about women's liberation. You have the haughty, dismissive emo poet, contenting himself with lurking around graveyards to get his Edgar Allan Poe vibes on. You have a bland Mary Sue character who spends several hours tracking down through the streets of London on what is easily the most boring and time-consuming game of cat and mouse ever. The list can go on and on. Vampire is not entirely open world, world by design, but rather the game will slowly grant you access to new areas over time and deny you access to other parts. In some ways, I would consider this game to be something akin to Bully Scholarship Edition, where the player is granted a partially open world environment containing certain areas that may or may not be accessible during certain parts of the story, or alternatively certain times during the day, or in this case, night. This is in complete contrast to what we would expect to see from more traditional AAA open world games, where you, the player, are thrown into a massive open world with almost all areas unlocked from the start, or easily accessed within a few hours of play, at which point you would be able to freely explore all areas at any time. Games like Shadow of Mordor or Grand Theft Auto 5 would meet this description. Combat in the game is carefully balanced in correlation with the player's stamina bar to ensure that players have to be selective about when and when not to engage in combat against a solo enemy or a group of enemies. This is not a game that you can merely hack and slash through every foe in sight without consequence. As a vampire, you do have access to a number of vampiric special abilities, the extent of which is determined by your blood meter, the dark red bar underneath your stamina bar. This will allow you to control your vampiric abilities and aid you in combat. Once the meter runs out, you will have to bite another human or animal in order to get blood points back, in order to continue using your special abilities. These abilities can be offensive or defensive in nature, some taking influence from classic vampire stories and myths, such as rudimentary mind control abilities, the ability to teleport short distances, increased immunity to common damage types such as bullet fire, and so on. These abilities, and many more besides, can be unlocked and subsequently upgraded using the in-game upgrade menu, which you can gain access to at the end of every night when your character crawls into bed for a good day's rest. While there is a main underlining quest present throughout, available to you at all times, with your character essentially transformed into a vampire hunter, attempting to fight off his vampiric urges and maintain his humanity, while simultaneously eliminating the local vampiric population one by one, and using their blood samples to unlock new treatments for both yourself and the afflicted patients suffering at your hospital. Speaking of vampires, the combat in this game can scale in difficulty depending on how morally righteous or morally ambiguous your character is. If you choose to harvest on many innocent people within the world, you'll easily level up and unlock new abilities at a rapid rate. Attempt to maintain the moral high ground and limit your biting habits, and you'll have a much harder time fighting minions or bosses. Now, there is a downside to killing too many innocent people within any area of the world. The more people you kill in any one district of the map, that part of the city will be condemned as being more dangerous, and thus the enemies in that district will raise in difficulty and increase in number. So it's a balancing act. You do want to upgrade your character, and biting humans is the best way to do it, but at the same time you can't go around slaughtering everyone you meet, because then you are going to be met with very strong opposition. And personally, I don't like to be ambushed by enemies at every corner, so I try to keep a fairly balanced diet as a vampire. I trade off between humans and rats. The rats aren't so tasty, but hey, who am I to say? I deliberately tried to stay away from biting innocent civilians, despite the combat disadvantage this would put me under later. Fighting even the early bosses in the game was a difficult chore, and in the case of some, it would take several tries in order to finally overcome them. The bosses gradually, as I got further into the game, reminded me more and more of the kind of bosses I would find in games like Dark Souls or Bloodborne. While not as infamously unforgiving as either of the aforementioned games, a morally pure vampire with few bites will be slaughtered in merely a few hits by any decent mini-boss or boss. So for those of you looking to attain perfect morality in this game, you're going to have a tough time staying alive long enough to beat the game. As for weaponry in this game, any good vampire hunter needs a strong loadout if they want to survive a single night against their fellow undead. At the start of the game, you'll be entirely relying on a pair of single-handed melee weapons, including a stake. Kind of ironic considering you're a vampire using a stake. Does no one else see the picture here? Anyway, over time you get access to a pistol, as well as some two-handed weapons like an axe, and many others besides. The conversation dialogue in the game works sufficiently well for what it sets out to do, but it, along with the voice acting that delivers it, can greatly vary in quality depending on the encounter. One of the things that Dontnod has a history of is delivering powerful, well-delivered dialogue in its games. The studio's most acclaimed hit, Life is Strange, received over 75 Game of the Year awards and nominations, including 5 BAFTA awards for storytelling and voice acting. I don't say this as if to suggest a comparison be made directly between Life is Strange and Vampyr, but from the perspective of someone who understands and appreciates the raw talent over at Don't Nod Entertainment, it feels like convincing dialogue is one of the areas that this game does suffer, which is really odd considering the studio's history with delivering solid voice acting and well-written responses. Many of the dialogue options within the game can be very misleading, often inaccurately describing with one or two simple words, entirely unrelated conversation responses, causing you, the player, to occasionally choose the wrong dialogue option because the game didn't accurately describe the nature of that response. In a game where the player's dialogue choice has a permanent impact on the relationships between your character and other characters within the world, inaccurate dialogue choice descriptions can leave a player with a negative outcome, unnecessarily making the experience a frustrating and unsatisfying one momentarily. The first 30 minutes of the game is essentially a unspoken tutorial, slowly easing you into the world of Vampyr, as well as the basic game mechanics you'll need to survive. However, the game doesn't go so far as to hold your hand, with enemies making their appearances within mere minutes of starting the game, forcing you to stand your toes, as opposed to most other games where the player is manually guided through obtrusive and often unskippable tutorials, teaching you even the most rudimentary of movement controls. And this is fine. Any tutorial that has to force you to learn basic WASD controls before allowing you to experience the full game is a tutorial that deserves to be thrown into a dark digital pit, never to be inflicted on players ever again. Now, the major point of contention between Vampyr Don't Nod enthusiasts and those who vehemently oppose the game: the estimated total game length. Vampyr is approximately 15 hours long depending on your playstyle. Some people online have criticized the game for charging $40 for a 15-hour long campaign, accusing the developers of short-changing buyers and giving them less value than other games. My own opinion on that, speaking as someone who has enjoyed the game but does see some obvious flaws with it, is what are you comparing it to? What are the expectations here? Let's take a look at some of the single-player campaigns from some of the best-selling AAA games over the past year. The Evil Within 2, 13 hours, 30 minutes. Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, 10 hours, 28 minutes. Sniper Elite 4, 10 hours, 14 minutes. Resident Evil 7, 9 hours, 24 minutes. Outlast 2, 7 hours, 31 minutes. Call of Duty World War II, 6 hours, 35 minutes. Star Wars Battlefront 2, 5 hours, 46 minutes. While you might have a few outliers like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild or Horizon Zero Dawn, it's hard to argue that single-player campaigns in recent years have been lengthy Skyrim-like campaigns, with hundreds of hours required in order to reach the final ending. Games have admittedly gotten shorter, but on the contrary, the average completion rate has gotten higher. While some players will always have the time and commitment to see a 100-hour game through to completion, there will always be 10 times as many players who will not be able to follow through on that same level of dedication. Companies have noticed that the amount of younger players, the ones who have the time and dedication to playing hundreds of hours in a single game in a short amount of time, have mostly moved over to online multiplayer social-driven games like Fortnite, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, Overwatch, Paladins, Rainbow Six Siege, and the like. While adult gamers, on the other hand, are generally more likely to buy single-player story-driven games that are generally shorter in length. So it makes sense that an M-rated horror action RPG like Vampyr went for a medium-length campaign that still manages to be longer than many of its AAA competition, but still shorter than your average Bethesda or Ubisoft game. However, the trade-off for being a shorter game is that Vampyr dedicates more resources to making the world and the characters that inhabit it feel more alive and authentic. So ultimately, it's a question of value. Do you value vast open sandbox worlds with mostly generic, poorly optimized backgrounds, vaguely connected by a mix of predetermined quests and random enemy encounters? Or do you value high attention to visual detail, solid optimization, enemy variety, engaging and entertaining boss fights, well-balanced stamina bars, a meaningful upgrades menu that has more than just generic health and damage upgrades, and wonderfully orchestrated period-fitting violin music to set the mood? Honestly, I know which one I prefer. I find the game length argument to be an artificial and uninformed discussion, as you can't really accurately sum up a game's value exclusively by its total runtime, without taking into account any of the other components within the game that make it unique, or lack thereof. My final score for Vampyr, based on the impressions I've gathered thus far, is an 8 out of 10. It absolutely delivers on the gameplay, the setting, the music, and in some cases the voice acting as well. But with the passable, serviceable, overarching story, and the rather questionable design choices in regards to certain gameplay mechanics such as conversation responses, there are many issues one can find here, and they're not the type of issues that can easily be rooted out and fixed with a simple day one hotfix patch. While Vampyr doesn't live up to the same storytelling quality expected of Don't Nod, especially following the overwhelming acclaim of Life is Strange, there is still a lot to love here. Personally, I think the $40 price tag is a little high for what is offered here, but I think there is value here in the game, so if I was in charge of pricing, God forbid that ever happened, I'd actually give people good value. I would have no problem pricing the game at $29.99. I think at that price, it's a grab. So if you see Vampyr hit that ideal $29.99 price drop, I would recommend picking it up right away, especially if you're a fan of action RPG games. Above that price, however, buyer beware. I'm not saying that you won't find entertainment in it, that might be worth $40, but I don't think that the game is worth it to everyone at that price range. I think that it does need a little bit of a drop. But as always, these are my opinions. That's it for this episode of What is the Point of? If you liked what I had to say, please do give that video a like, help me appease the YouTube gods, and share your opinions on this game down below in the comments. Would you buy it, and if so, how much would you be willing to pay? Let me know down in the comments below. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, and peace out.
Yeah, 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 yeah.